Your lecturer is Robert Greenberg. Dr. Greenberg is music historian in residence with San Francisco Performances and the composer of more than 50 works for a variety of instrumental and vocal ensembles. He received his PhD in music composition from the University of California, Berkeley. A former instructor with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, Dr. Greenberg is an authority on a range of composers and classical music genres. His masterful compositions have won 3 Nicola de Lorenzo Composition Prizes, a Kusevitsky Commission from the Library of Congress, and he is a Steinway artist.
Here we are, nearly 1/5 of the way through the 21st century, and many music lovers, if not most, have yet to come to terms with what happened to concert music during the 20th century, during the last century, during them good old days. Well, we are far enough past those good old days that a certain perspective has been achieved and appropriate appraisals can now be made. And thus, this series, in which the overarching goal is to give you, my listeners and viewers, a handle on the literate or concert music of the 20th century. 1/5 of the way through the 21st century, we need no longer be afraid of the music of the 20th century. Like most first lectures, this one is about good housekeeping. It's about establishing parameters, making some broad statements that will be filled in subsequent sessions, and about providing some deep background that will help to put the musical events of the 20th century into a broad perspective. What this course is. This course will trace the development of Western literate music, meaning art music or concert music, from the very late 19th century through the end of the 20th century. It will define, explore, and seek to historically contextualize the vast number of musical styles, of isms, that evolved during the 20th century, including Impressionism, Expressionism, Fauvism, Neoclassicism, Serialism and Ultra-Serialism, Stochasticism, Minimalism, the New Romanticism, and so forth-ism. Mostly, this series will seek to explain why, historically, culturally, and musically, why the traditional tonal musical language, without any doubt, the greatest musical syntactical construct ever created by our species, a musical language employed quite successfully by composers ranging from Monteverdi to Mozart, Bach to Beethoven, from Haydn and Schubert and Chopin and Brahms to Tchaikovsky and all them dead Eurocats, from Israel Bellin, that would be Irving Berlin, Jacob Gershowitz, that would be George Gershwin, Robert Zimmerman, that would be Bob Dylan, to John Lennon, that would be John Lennon. Why the traditional tonal language became increasingly irrelevant to an increasingly large number of composers as the 20th century progressed. Yes, I'll be the first to admit the risks of abandoning traditional tonality were and remain huge. Chief among those risks, the alienation of the bulk of the listening audience. This is something we will discuss at length, though I personally take some limited solace in the knowledge that in their own time, neither Bach, Mozart, nor Beethoven, for example, were considered among the popular composers of their time. Generally, but accurately speaking, the majority of their mature works were considered by their contemporaries to be too long, too complicated, and too esoteric, which reminds us that all music was, once upon a time, new music. An existential characteristic of new music is that it is new. It lacks familiarity and will therefore rarely fall easily on the ears of its contemporary audience. So let's take heart. The issue of audience comprehensibility in 20th century music is nothing new. So even as we come to grips with the demise of traditional tonality, we will observe that in its place, there evolved a dazzling variety of new approaches to the musical language, some of them admittedly less listenable than others, but all of them fascinating and completely of their time. For example, I'm going to ask you to listen to the beginnings of 4 pieces of mid-20th century music written within just 9 years of each other. The opening fanfare of Igor Stravinsky's ballet Aegon of 1957, the opening of Terry Riley's In C of 1964, the opening of Pierre Boulez's Structures for 2 Pianos of 1961, and the opening of the 4th movement of Walter Piston's Symphony No. 6 of 1955. Listen, please, to about the first 2 minutes of each. If you choose to go further, good for you, but do try to survive that long. From the brilliant neoclassicism of Stravinsky's fanfare opening to Aegon, to the throbbing joy of Terry Riley's minimalist masterpiece In C, to the take-no-prisoners modernism of Pierre Boulez's Structures Book 2, to the uplifting Americana of the 4th movement of Walter Piston's Symphony No. 6, these 4 works would seem to come from different planets, and yet they were composed at almost exactly the same time. Not since the construction of the Tower of Babel had so many artists working cheek by jowl spoken so many different languages. Our approach. Our approach to the dazzling variety of 20th century music will take 3 intersecting tracks. Track 1, context. Typical of what I do, we will explore the evolving languages of 20th century concert music as a reflection of a rapidly, often dangerously changing environment. Track 2 focuses on the big boys, the 3 most important and influential composers of the 20th century were Claude Debussy, Arnold Schoenberg, and Igor Stravinsky. We can argue about this if you like, but trust me, it's an argument I will win. As such, these composers will receive special attention. Track 3, the scattershot. Even though this course will focus primarily on the principal musical trends of 20th century concert music and the principal composers who pioneered those trends, it will be necessary to spread the love around just a bit. Thus, lectures 13, entitled American Iconoclasts, 21, entitled East Meets West, South Meets North, and 23, entitled The New Pluralism, together feature 16 different composers. One could correctly say that these 3 lectures are my way of assuaging my guilt for leaving so many otherwise wonderful composers out of this survey. What this course is not. My guilt notwithstanding, this course is not, it cannot be comprehensive. The list of worthy 20th century composers who are missing is at least as long as those who are included. This cannot be helped. Again, this series is about the principal musical trends manifested in the concert music of the 20th century and the historical issues and events that shaped those trends. It cannot be about each and every high-end composer who lived and worked in the 20th century. The most glaring omission in this survey is that of the composers of the Soviet Union. There is nary a mention of either Dmitri Shostakovich or any other composer associated with the Soviet Union, including Sergei Prokofiev, who returned to live in the Soviet Union in 1936 during the height of Stalin's purges, a stupid decision that cost him dearly. Those who know my work with the great courses know I'm crazy about these two. I've recorded a great master's biography of Shostakovich and have featured Shostakovich's and Prokofiev's music in the courses on the symphony, the concerto, the 23 greatest solo piano works, and in music as a mirror of history. But their music, like such fellow Soviet composers as Aram Khachaturian and Nikolai Mayakovsky and Dmitry Kabalevsky, had to somehow coexist with the spirit-stifling, creativity-crushing artistic requirements of what was called Soviet socialist realism, which demanded that their music serve not their egos, but the Soviet state. It remains a triumph of will and creativity that both Shostakovich and Prokofiev could have composed so much great music under these circumstances. Having said that, Soviet realism died with glasnost and simply cannot be considered a principal, cutting-edge musical trend of the 20th century. For professional musicians, composers in particular, the cast of characters featured in this course will be familiar, but that is as it must be. This series is not designed for my fellow professionals, but rather for those who want to get a grip on the often daunting progression of compositional thought and style as it evolves across the 20th century. As such, this course will exhibit the same terrible, if unavoidable flaw as every other such survey, and that is the diminution of the role played by the many in favor of works composed by a few. Possible histories. One last statement concerning what this course is and is not. There are, I think, countless different possible histories of 20th century music. I can only tell one of them, my history of 20th century music. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1954 and grew up in suburban New Jersey. I've played the piano since the earliest age and made something of a living playing jazz in my late teens and 20s. As a composer, I was trained at elite academic institutions. I have lived in the San Francisco Bay Area since 1978 and have spent the bulk of my career teaching music history for a living. All of these experiences have shaped and conditioned my ear, my heart, and my thought processes to the degree that my take on the music of the 20th century will be radically different from that of someone who grew up in Paris or Berlin or Shanghai, or came out of such musical traditions as rock and roll, or Andalusian flamenco, or North Indian raga, or Bhutanese alpine trumpet playing. As a composer, I have become more of a populist than a modernist, which, despite my best attempts to be even-handed, cannot help but affect my take on the music we will study. So while this history of 20th century music is my history, I claim no monopoly on the 20th century, and I look forward, yes, I really do, to other histories, other takes, and other interpretations. A word or two about Lecture 24. I recorded my first Great Courses / Teaching Company course in May of 1993. The 24th and final lecture of this course will be, auspiciously, the 666th lecture I've recorded for the Great Courses. Auspicious because 666 is the number of the beast. That 24th and final lecture of this series, entitled Among Friends, represents the first time in all my 666 lectures that I will actually talk about my own music. Yes, my experience as a composer has informed every single one of my previous 665 lectures. But despite the fact that I've been writing music since I was 5 years old and have a PhD in music composition, I have never talked about my own music until now. I am most aware that by doing so, I will open myself up to the accusation of wanton self-service. So allow me, please, to explain why I have done so. Reason one, as we just observed, this course is my history of 20th century music. My history is shaped by my experiences and perceptions, and you have every right to hear how those experiences and perceptions have shaped my music as well. I suppose that means that if you hate my music, you can dismiss my history. But you'll only know that once you get to lecture 24. So it's a risk I'm willing to take. Reason two, my childhood was, on its surface, quite typical of someone growing up in the United States in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We know how Mozart's childhood affected his music, and how Beethoven's and Brahms's childhoods affected their music. However, their childhoods were not of our time, and as such, identifying with their childhoods is, well, difficult. But I am of our time, and I believe that knowing something of my life and choices will help you to understand not just my music, but will help you to become more sympathetic towards living composers and their music in general. Reason three, for 25 years, the good folks who have purchased my courses have listened to me lecture, rant, pontificate, opine, and even on the rarest of occasions, bloviate. After a quarter of a century, it's time for me to walk the walk and present you with my bona fides. Where are all the examples of 20th century music? Yes, where indeed. There aren't any. This should not bother anyone a whit, as virtually every one of the nearly 150 pieces under discussion in this series can be heard and in many cases seen in performance for free on the internet. If this course were like virtually every other of my great courses surveys, I would immediately play for you excerpts of the musical works under discussion, the better to engage your ears immediately after having described a particular passage. But copyright law precludes me from playing music by composers who have been dead for less than 75 years without paying massive licensing fees to the estates of those composers. This is precisely why we haven't made a full, no-holds-barred 20th century music course to date. The cost of licensing is beyond prohibitive. But contemporary technology has come to our rescue, so URLs and appropriate timings have been provided that will allow you to hear precisely what I want you to hear while we move through the course. Our preliminaries are done. Off now to some deep background that will create a context for the music of the 20th century. You can't take it to town if you can't write it down. The invention of music notation sometime during the 9th century began a tectonic shift in Western music, away from an oral tradition towards a literate tradition. It was an invention that made composed music, that is, calculated and constructed music, possible. The initial impetus behind the invention of music notation was neither artistic nor religious, but rather political. You see, at the heart of medieval worship lay a genre of music called plain chant. The men, women, boys, and girls who lived and worked and ministered to Europe's monasteries, convents, and cathedrals spent a tremendous amount of time in prayer. By singing, or at very least chanting those prayers, the liturgy could be more easily memorized. Of equal importance were the reinforcing beliefs that one must call upon God in song and never in a common speaking voice, and that such song calmed the soul and rendered the singer or chanter susceptible to divine influence. The growing profusion of regional plain chant during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries was noted with growing discomfort by the Roman Church, which itself employed a body of chant now referred to as Old Roman chant. The Roman Church, which was the westernmost jurisdictional center, or see, in Christendom, was discomfited by regional plain chant because of the provincial independence such regionalism implied. If regional churches were going to decide for themselves what chants to sing, and thus which prayers to say, and what rites to conduct, then the authority of the Roman Church, which was the Church of St. Peter, after all, would become just so much chopped wafer. In its effort to unify the liturgy based on its own practices, the single greatest challenge facing the Roman Church was that of transmission. How precisely to communicate accurately its musical repertoire to the many and far-flung churches of Western Europe? The solution was earth-shaking. Figure out a way to write the music down. The first system of music notation to gain near universal usage is today called Carolingian pneumatic notation, a system of zigzags and squiggles notated above words that describe approximately what was to be sung. Yeah, the key word here is approximately. This first systematic approach to music notation was intended merely as a mnemonic device, a reminder, a crib sheet for melodies already learned orally. Such rudimentary notation coexisted with the oral tradition for at least 200 years, until a very clever priest, whose job it was to train singers for the church, came up with an innovation that made not only his job easier, but at the same time made literate music, the composer, and therefore the music of the 20th century possible. Guido of Arezzo. This priest's name was Guido, and he lived from about 990 to about 1033. He received his education at the Benedictine Abbey of Pomposa, about 25 miles east of Ferrara in northern Italy. Guido established a reputation for being able to teach choir boys new chants in record time. Moving to the city of Arezzo in Tuscany, Guido wrote a number of theoretical treatises. One of them, entitled Micrologus, meaning little treatise, and completed around 1028, is among the most important books on music ever written. It's in Micrologus that Guido expounds on his teaching techniques, a central component of which was a new method of music notation that would allow someone to sing both familiar and unfamiliar plain chants at sight. Among many other things, Guido superimposed a gamut, or a series, of 22 stepwise pitches on a 4-line staff or graph, consisting of alternating lines and spaces. He then placed neumes, those zigzag squiggles, directly on the staff. By doing so, he was able to specify the precise pitch relationships between each neume. In terms of notating pitch, Guido's was the conceptual leap, the eureka moment. Guido taught his students to sight-read neumes notated on the staff using the syllables ut, or do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. The seventh step, si or ti, would be added later. These so-called solfege syllables are used in sight reading classes to this very day. And thanks to Guido of Arezzo, they have become the bane of music students for 1,000 years. The agonies of learning solfege aside, Guido's little treatise was the most frequently copied and widely circulated music theory book for the next 400 years. Guido's staff notation changed the very nature of Western music. It was pitch specific. It allowed pitches to be notated exactly, and thus the medium itself, the notation, contained the message. The huge repertoire of old Roman chant was subsequently notated and came to be treated as a canon, as a body of work permanently established as being of the highest importance and quality. Because it was notated, written down, this canon of plain chant could be interpreted, extended, and elaborated in a way that oral tradition music cannot. Notation also gave birth to the concept of a piece of music as hard copy, as a physical entity. Increasingly, over time, notated music came to be objectified, and despite the vagaries of interpretation, it came to be subjected to analyses that treated it as a fixed and impermeable thing rather than as an act. Notation allowed music to outlive those contemporaries who merely remembered it. Indeed, music notation created something lasting that could eventually be considered a classic, something separate from the time and place of its creation. But still, there's more. Staff notation created the necessary preconditions for the emergence of the composer, a specialist who could not only write down his musical ideas, but then modify them, extend them, and in all ways construct and compose them before turning his work over to performers, specialists as well, trained to read and perform notated music. The advent of the composer and of composed and constructed music represented the great leap from the oral tradition. For a composer, the creation of music is a proactive, reflective act rather than a reactive, improvisatory act. For a composer, first ideas are only that, moments of inspiration that must then be shaped, molded, manipulated, extended, revised, or even, if necessary, erased or just thrown out. Just how musical ideas are shaped, molded, manipulated, extended, and revised is a function of an individual composer's knowledge, skill, and experience. No two people are exactly alike, and just so, no two composers, whether they are writing music for the church or symphonies for a prince or soundtracks for movies, no two composers will write the same music. And to some degree or another, a given composer's work, just like a given author's work or a given painter's work, will inevitably reflect something of the environment in which its creator lives and works. Composing made the making of music personal, and the notated entities composers created became objects of art. We generally understand the Western cult, the Western fetish, for individual musical expression as having begun some 200 years ago with the music of Beethoven. But in fact, as soon as these evolving specialists called composers began to sign their work around the end of the 13th century, the issue of the creative ego had become singularly enmeshed in Western literate music. Composers took pride in their work and wanted to differentiate it from the music of other composers. As the world changed, and with it the private lives and professional demands placed on composers, so too did the style, the sound of their music change as well. As the rate of change in the Western world sped up, so too, inevitably, did the rate of stylistic change in Western music speed up. In the increasingly industrialized, middle-class-dominated 19th century, the rate of change intrinsic to Western music went into hyperdrive, swept up entirely by the idea of personal self-expression that had been engendered by the Enlightenment, by the Age of Revolution, by the Napoleonic era, and by the bad boy from Bonn, Ludwig, my friends call me Louis, van Beethoven. 19th century composers sought to achieve an ever greater range of expression in their music. Part of that ever greater range of expression was a desire to create music characterized by a personal signature, music that could be identified as having been written by one composer and one composer only. During the 19th century, personal musical styles replaced the generalized period styles of earlier centuries. The traditional tonal system. By the year 1600, a musical language called tonality, or the traditional tonal system, was used universally by Western composers. It is a system that balanced and controlled melodic motion, the horizontal element of music, with chords or harmonies, the simultaneous sounding of 3 or more pitches, the vertical aspect of music. As the chords or harmonies moved one to the next, they could project a state of tension or a state of rest. Or they could transit between a state of rest and tension. This magnificent tonal system, which was tweaked and expanded and thus became ever more complex over the centuries, could not live forever. Nothing does. That's because the ever-growing expressive demands of 19th century composers, the first me generation of composers, was bending, spindling, and mutilating tonality almost beyond recognition in their attempt always to be original. It was only a matter of time until traditional tonality, pushed to the edge of comprehensibility by the ever more extreme expressive demands of such composers as Richard Wagner, Johannes Brahms, Gustav Mahler, Richard Strauss, and Alexander Scriabin. It was only a matter of time until traditional tonality could no longer serve the expressive needs of more forward-looking composers. Time ran out on traditional tonality in the years around the turn of the 20th century. And while the more experimental music of that time still sounds shockingly new, it is, in truth, music that exhibits the same sort of change that had been operative in Western music for centuries. The difference is, of course, the rate of change. The concert music of the 20th century demonstrates in itself as much syntactical and expressive variety as the previous 500 years' worth of music combined. It was a musical stylistic rate of change that mirrored the events of the 20th century itself. Change, change, and more change. The rate of change witnessed during the 20th century was mind-numbing, often bladder-weakening, and sometimes even soul-searing. And given what we as a species had become accustomed to over, say, the previous 100,000 years, it was entirely disconcerting. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the invention and development of technologies that changed the very way human beings perceive time and distance: the telephone, the automobile, and the airplane. At the same time, the invention of mass media changed forever the way information, including music, was transferred and consumed. The motion picture, the record player, and the radio. The work of Planck, Freud, and Einstein altered entirely our species' vision of the universe, both within us and around us. In the process, the stable, rational, God-created universe espoused by Newton was replaced by notions of quanta and uncertainty, weird science. Einstein, miserably unhappy with the implications of his own work on quantum physics, went to his grave insisting that basically Newton had to be right, that there had to be a unified field theory that could unite the laws of physics under a single model. In support of this conviction, Einstein famously claimed that, quote, God does not play dice with the universe, unquote. To which the great Danish physicist Niels Bohr just as famously rejoined, quote, Einstein, stop telling God what to do, unquote. Not since the collapse of the absolute authority of the medieval church back in the 14th century had Western humankind had to deal with such a loss of intellectual and spiritual footing as it did during the first half of the 20th century. Speaking broadly, we as a species coped poorly. In the bloodbath that was World War I, 1914 to 1918, 19th century nationalist chauvinism and hubris, ancient and slow-footed empires, and antiquated military tactics combined with 20th century technology to create a level of mayhem new to human experience. Of the 5 empires that entered that war, only one, the British Empire, emerged relatively intact. The empires of Russia, the Ottoman Turks, of Germany, and Austria-Hungary were destroyed and dismantled. In the newly established Soviet Union, the carnage continued until 1921 as a result of civil war. The catastrophe that was the First World War, with its clash of old and new, of imperialism and modernity, was directly responsible for the advent of both communism and fascism, the 2 great political and social disasters of the 20th century. World War II in Europe from 1939 to 1945 picked up where World War I left off, after an appropriate interbellum period to grow a new generation of cannon fodder. World War II was the single greatest calamity to befall the human race since the expulsion from Eden. And it has been argued, persuasively I think, that World War II did not really end until 1991 with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Add to this in no way inclusive catalog of human stupidity and waste the genocidal and politicide mass murders in Armenia from 1915 to 1923, Ukraine, 1932 to 1933, Bangladesh, 1971, Cambodia, 1975 to 79, and Rwanda, 1994. Most numerically mind-boggling was the butchery in China, first by the Japanese Imperial Empire. Between 1931 and 1945, the Japanese invasion of China claimed between 20 and 35 million military and civilian Chinese lives, and then in the name of Chinese communism and Chairman Mao, who, according to Zheng Chang and John Halliday, was responsible for over 70 million peacetime deaths. This horrific litany is not meant to imply that the 20th century had nothing to offer the human race but misery and death. However, the epic disruption and consequent crises created by these events are among the primary landmarks that must guide any examination of the 20th century, and that includes 20th century music. The same breakdown of traditional civility and morality that has been used to account for the outbreak of World War I can be observed in the breakdown of traditional functional tonality between roughly 1894 and 1914. The diametrically opposed artistic nostalgia and modernist experimentation of the interwar era were, each in its own way, an ongoing response to the calamity of World War I. The artistic limits placed on Soviet composers after 1930, about which we will not speak further, were a direct reflection of Soviet totalitarianism. The explosion of highly intellectualized music after the Second World War was a direct response to the catastrophe of European fascism, which was perceived as having been a product of mystical nationalism intensified by romantic expressive emotionalism. While we cannot know how the 20th century will be described in the distant future, there are historians who are already referring to it as a period of 100 Years' War. That would be from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 through the end of the war in Kosovo in 1999, or a 70 Years' War from World War I until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a 30 Years' War from the beginning of World War I to the end of World War II, or simply as the decline of the West, as the historian and philosopher Oswald Spengler entitled his classic study of 1918. Perhaps the music historians of the future will come to refer to the 20th century as the age of Babel. That's Babel as in B-A-B-E-L and not B-A-B-B-L-E. Or the era of earnestly neurotic hyper-individuality. Or perhaps the age of syntactical lunacy,